Benvenuti. Welcome, everyone. This, I believe, is my 24th talk on Italy.
Wow.
Joining me for this presentation on Assisi is my welcome to you and my stimulation, I hope, to have you thinking about a return to this glorious medieval hill town of Umbria as soon as you can. Most of you know me, some of you may not. My name is Anne Robichaud. I've lived in Umbria since 1975 in the Assisi countryside. Moved here with my husband Pino from Palermo. We worked the land for many years. I had an English. Pino is a builder and a restorer of architecture, and I have always worked as a tour guide. I haven't been working as a tour guide since COVID has hit, and I'm still working as a tour guide in another way now, virtually. And it's a pleasure to have you with me for this first talk on Assisi's treasures. We're going to start talking about Assisi outside the medieval walls. And we're going to be mentioning some of the important sites to St. Francis, including the Hermitage, a place of refuge for him, San Damiano, where he restored the church after hearing a crucifix speak to him, his little church within a church, the Porziuncola. But we're also going to be talking about important civic monuments of Assisi related to wars and bellicose moments, including the fortress, the war cemetery. So let us get started. And I think a perfect place to start is at the little church of San Damiano outside of the walls of Assisi, just a few minutes walk from the main center of Assisi. It is immortalized actually in a fresco. This fresco is in the upper Basilica of St. Francis in the town. You can see it here on the left. And it is a fresco depicting Francis praying before the crucifix of the rundown church of San Damiano in 1205. He's in the dress of a wealthy young man. He was wearing brilliant red. The red is faded with time, of course. After all, this fresco is from the late 13th century, attributed to the school of Giotto. And he has just returned from the war with Perugia some years before. Young man devastated by the war with Perugia. And when he returns to Assisi, he has decided that he no longer wishes to live the life of a wealthy cloth merchant son, but wishes to embrace a life of poverty. He's praying outside the walls in this rundown church of San Damiano, and he asked the crucifix, the Byzantine crucifix hanging over the altar, "Lord, what do you wish of me?" He's surprised when he hears a voice answer, "Rebuild this church." Look at his hands there raised in surprise. On the right, you can see the church of San Damiano as we see it today. And this is the view that you would have if you went down by car, parked your car, and walked up this path between the cypress trees to this little church of San Damiano. Let's get a closer view of it. This is San Damiano as we see it today. To the left is the Franciscan Monastery. Franciscans now live there, although the site was first the residence of Clare of Assisi and her followers. She was 11 years younger than Francis, wished to embrace his life of poverty. She and her community lived at San Damiano. They were therefore called by the Assisiani the Damianite, the ladies of St. Damian's. If you choose to walk to San Damiano, you can take a little path just outside one of the city gates, right down Via San Damiano, and you'll be passing a Roman tomb of the 1st century BC. And just after the Roman tomb, you come to a tiny little church. It's really a chapel. It is called La Cappella di San Feliciano, but the locals call it San Felicianuccio, Little San Feliciano. This little church is a recent building built over the site of previous religious structures, most likely, because on this site, San Feliciano, first Christian bishop of Foligno, was martyred in the 3rd century AD. So that Roman tomb that I just showed you is just around the back of this. And I want to mention the Roman tomb for this specific reason. San Damiano was an edifice in which the Benedictines prayed and lived. It was their spiritual focal point. And probably their little church was built on the site of an 8th to 9th century edifice. But the area of San Damiano was a sacred site to the Romans because near San Damiano are springs called the Springs of Santorajo. That's a medieval terminology. The springs of the holy rays of light, called Santoraggio in Assisano dialect. But the Springs of Santoraggio were said to have miraculous healing powers by the Romans all the way through the Middle Ages. It was the site of sacred waters. So a sacred Roman site is near the Church of San Damiano. As you arrive at the Church of San Damiano, you will see a rather contemporary bronze statue of Clare of Assisi, who almost triumphantly, sternly is holding high the monstrance, which holds the sacred host. Monstrance comes from the word mostrar, to show. And it is said that she held that monstrance out the window of San Damiano in 1240, when Saracens, who were troops threatening the convent sent to attack Assisi by the Emperor Frederick II, attacked the city, and she held out the monstrance out the window of San Damiano, terrifying them, and they ran away. As you enter San Damiano, on the right to the entrance, you'll see one of the beautiful frescoes by a local Assisi painter, the Maestro Di San Crispino, a 14th century fresco. And this is the Madonna enthroned, holding the Christ child. To her right, which would be our left, is the most important figure, San Francesco. To her left is the secondary figure, but still important because she is near the Virgin, St. Clare of Assisi. Francis is touching on the head as if to present him to the Virgin. Take care of this man, he's saying. This is simply an individual called the pious man. This is probably the patron who paid for the fresco. That's your straight ticket to heaven in the Middle Ages. Sponsor a fresco and get yourself put right into it. So everybody praying before this Madonna is also praying for him and his eternal soul. To the left of Francis, right here, is a depiction of the first bishop of Assisi, who is the patron saint of Assisi. Remember, everybody, that Francis is the patron saint of Italy. To the right is San Damiano. But let's first talk about the patron saint of Assisi, the figure to the left of Francis. San Rufino, the Cathedral of Assisi, is named after him. It is built near to the site where he was martyred in the 3rd century AD. To the right of Clare is Damiano. This is the Church of San Damiano. I've been trying to figure out why it wasn't called the Church of the Saints Cosmas and Damiano. I've talked to many historians about this all week, authors of books and so forth. We don't have evidence of that. It's interesting that it is dedicated to simply Damiano. There's a great church in Rome dedicated to Cosma and Damiano because they were twins, Roman medical doctors. Interestingly, the medical doctor, let's remember that this Church of San Damiano is built very close to the Roman sacred streams with healing powers, those waters. So San Damiano, San Rufino, and they flank Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi. Just after you pass this fresco, you'll come to a fresco by Francesco Tartaglia, who's a modest Umbrian painter, and he frescoes in 1510. And this is probably a votive fresco. That is a fresco done requesting assistance from the Lord, invoking assistance. Probably this is a fresco commissioned at the time of an outbreak of the plague, because the two saints depicted next to Clare and Francis are the patron saints invoked at times of pestilence. Saint Sebastian, martyred in the 3rd century AD. You can see all the arrows perforating his body. And San Rocco, called by the French Saint Roch. He was a 14th century saint administered to pilgrims on their way to Rome. And during an outbreak of pestilence, the bubonic plague, miraculously healed people. So he's the patron saint invoked at an outbreak of pestilence. And there could have been one at this time. The most serious outbreak of the bubonic plague was the mid-14th century, but the plague will reoccur again and again. After you pass that fresco, you enter a small chapel, and it is dedicated to to San Girolamo, Saint Jerome. The painter is Tiberio di Assisi. He frescoes this in 1517. We have here the Virgin holding the Christ child on her lap. To her right is Saint Jerome, his Bible opened, and next to Saint Jerome is Saint Bernard of Siena holding the plaque on which there would be incised IHS, Jesus Hominum Salvatorum, Jesus Christ, Savior of mankind, which he always held up as he preached. On the Virgin's left is Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi as well. After you leave the little chapel of San Girolamo, you pass through the small chapel called the Cappella del Crocifisso, the chapel of the Crucifixion. And here we have in this chapel a crucifixion depicting Christ crucified. It was done by a Franciscan friar in the early 17th century. And he depicts a very, if you will, dramatic crucifixion here. The locals will tell you that depending on the position of the viewer, Christ's expression will change. And this is a crucifixion very much venerated by the locals. And you pass this crucifixion here, and you enter finally La Chiesa di San Damiano, the Church of San Damiano, very much restored, of course, from the time when Francis prayed there for the first time in 1205. So restored many times over the centuries. We're going to talk about the fresco we can see behind the altar in a moment, but I'd also like to mention the crucifix hanging here. This is a copy of the crucifix said to have spoken to Francis in 1205, saying, "Francis, rebuild my church." And that crucifix now is hanging in the Basilica of St. Clare, the original crucifix. And that is because Clare and her community will stay in this church of San Damiano from the early 13th century. I think about 1212, the community is there. But after her death in 1253, the poor Clares, as they're called, the Clarisse in Italian, later called Le Clarisse. At the time she died, they were still called the Damian ladies, the Damianite. They donate the church of San Damiano to the Cathedral of San Rufino. And they are given in exchange a little 12th century church called San Giorgio, which no longer exists. Because after many difficulties, they finally are affirmed full ownership of that church, and a basilica is built on the site of San Giorgio in honor of Clare of Assisi, who's canonized in 1255. And she is then buried in 1260 in the Basilica of St. Clare. And therefore, the original crucifix of San Damiano is now in the Basilica of St. Clare. Let's talk about the fresco in the altar area, in the presbytery, as it's called, above the choir. This is by the Maestro Di Farneto. It's a fresco of the 13th, 14th century. The Virgin enthroned between, on her right, which would be our left, San Rufino, first Christian bishop of Assisi, and on her left, our right as you look at it, San Damiano, Roman doctor. Also to be seen when you're at the Church of San Damiano is the lovely cloister of the 16th century. This is a cloister which has been there probably for centuries, but restored in the 16th century. And the friars would walk around the cloister as they pray and meditate. And in a corner of this colonnade here, or this portico, there is a fresco, which is quite a lovely fresco. It is by Eusebio di San Giorgio, and it was done in the early 16th century. And, you know, during this COVID time, this has been an extraordinary time to visit these Franciscan sites. And when I was there last week, I was at San Damiano a couple of times. The only person there was a Franciscan who was a guardian of the place. And this is Father Mauro. And we talked about these frescoes. And he's pointing out to me the fresco on the left, which depicts Francis on Mount Laverne in Tuscany, receiving the stigmata a couple years before his death, when the six-winged angel, the seraph, appears to him, and he comes down from the mountain with the wounds of Christ in his hands and feet. On the right, we have an Annunciation, and the Virgin is here in an enclosed courtyard. The angel Gabriel appears to her, asking her to be the mother of God, holding the lily, symbol of purity. God the Father in the heavens blessing her. The dove swoops down. And look at the crenellated walls with the high bastions around the courtyard. Let us remember that an Annunciation always depicts Mary in an enclosed space. This is a symbol of her virginity. If you enter, you can't really enter. If you look in the door just to the left of where Padre Mauro is, you can see the refectory where Clare and the community had their meals. At the table where she sat, there are always flowers marking the spot where Clare was seated with the other Damianite. The frescoes are of the 17th century by Cesare Serme. Here, Francis prays before a crucified Christ. At the other end of the refectory, we have Clare and her community. The sisters are lower than the cardinals, at a meal with Pope Gregory IX and cardinals or bishops. And it said at his meal at San Damiano, Clare asked him to make a blessing on the foods, and he said to her, "Kindly do the blessing." She did not wish to. She hesitated. He encouraged her. She raised her hand in blessing, and it said crosses, crucifixes appeared miraculously on each of the rolls or the loaves of bread. After you visit the refectory, you can take steps up to the Oratory of St. Clare. It is a lovely little chapel frescoed over various periods of time. The frescoes we're seeing here are probably 14th, 15th century. And this is the site of the place where Clare withdrew for prayer and meditation. And near the spot where she died in 1253, I believe she died August 11th. And according to tradition, this is also very close to the little garden, which you'd see if you looked out the window here, where Francis stayed for about 50 days, about 2 years before his death. This would have been about, I think it was the winter 1224, 1225. And it is here, he was very ill. He was cared for by the Damianite. He had a chronic eye disease, which he probably contracted during his visit to the Middle East, and nearly blind by the time he died, in constant pain day and night. It is here where he composed the first poem ever in the Italian vernacular, the lovely Canticle of the Creatures, praising the Lord for all of creation, brother, sun, sister, moon, and so forth. Next to this oratory is the Dormitorio De La Clarisse, where the Clares or the Damianite slept. And it is in this corner here, under this crucifix, where Clare of Assisi died in 1253. And it's out this window, it said, that she held that monstrance holding the sacred host, which terrified the Saracen troops attacking Assisi at order of Frederick II in 1240. The Canticle of the Creatures. This photo of a copy of the Canticle of the Creatures. This is the first copy of the Canticle of the Creatures written down. It is a precious document in the library of the Franciscans, which is attached to the Basilica of San Francesco. He recited this praise of the Lord for all of creation, and it was written down by others. So the writing is not in St. Francis's hand. And one of the elements which he praised very much is Brother Wind. And there's a lovely sculpture, a bronze sculpture of Frate Vento by Fiorenzo Bacci, a contemporary sculptor. He's from the town of Todi here in Umbria. And it's his depiction of Brother Wind, Francis, the wind driving, and he's got his cloak around him. And it almost seems, Bacci says he wants it to seem that Francis is almost as comforted by the wind. And this is, let me read you the line from the Canticle of the Creatures, citing Brother Wind by Francis. Praise to you, my Lord, through Brother Wind and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather. Another depiction, or how can we say, configuration of a symbol of the Canticle of the Creatures, another sculpture by Bacci. You can see at the end of this walkway as you're leaving San Damiano. San Damiano would be at your back. You're walking down this pathway. It's flanked by cypress trees on the right. They point to the sky, symbolizing infinity. They line the way to places of rest and repose. They often line the way to cemeteries. And just here, as you're at the last cypress tree, under an olive tree, you see the Bacci sculpture. And this is Francis reflecting on the light of the setting sun in praise of Brother Sun. And this is the same sculpture, and I took this photo from the back. And it seems he's looking out at San Damiano. From San Damiano at the Basilica di Santa Maria degli Angeli, the 16th century basilica built over another little chapel that was very dear to him, the Porziuncola, which we're going to be talking about. And I'd like to read to you the first line, one of the first lines of the Canticle, in which Francis praises Brother Sun. Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Brother Sun, who is the day, and through whom you give us light. And he's looking at Santa Maria degli Angeli. So let us go down the hill and visit Santa Maria degli Angeli. You can walk down from San Damiano. It's probably 1.5 kilometers. It's a lovely, lovely walk through the countryside, but there are also buses going down very frequently. And Santa Maria degli Angeli is a basilica built over the little treasured chapel of Francesco, and it is a grandiose basilica. And looking at it, sometimes one can ask, it's a common question asked, even if we ask Franciscans, what would have Francis have thought of this glorious basilica? And I asked Father Dante that the other day when I visited the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli. And he said Francis would have known that the church was not for his glorification, but for the glorification of the Lord. This basilica was built in the mid-16th century. It was designed by Galeazzo Alessi of Perugia at the request of the Pope, Saint Pius V. And work was started in 1569, but it was only finished about 110 years later. Many friars were hostile to the structure of this basilica. They didn't want an enormous, glorious church covering over the little Porziuncola, the little chapel, which Francis also restored. He worked on restoration of this little abandoned chapel, which he had come across while wandering in the countryside, the wooded area of the valley just below Assisi in 1209. And he came across this little church nearly abandoned. It too was a Benedictine church. San Damiano was a Benedictine site for many centuries, probably as of about the 9th century. This was a Benedictine church as well, 8th or 9th century. And the church was dedicated to the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, but it was in disrepair, nearly abandoned. And Francis set to work repairing that as well. And as of about 1210, he did request from the Benedictines possible use of this church because he realized that there were already quite a few other young men that he would call little brothers, frati minori, interested in his message of poverty and denial of possession. He already had quite a following. Probably by about 1211, this is when the Order of the Friars Minor is founded, and there are about 12 followers at this time. And the Benedictines, therefore, give him use of this church. That wasn't a problem for the Benedictines because it was just one of 23 little chapels under jurisdiction of the Benedictine Abbey Church, which is now in ruins, on the slopes of Mount Subasio. They also had 10 churches, all under that one abbey church. And Francis didn't want the church to be given. And so I think for years, symbolically, he didn't want to receive it, wanted to feel it was his possession. So I think symbolically, for many years, the friars gave the Benedictines a basket of fish every year. As a contribution to their use of San Damiano, and thanks for their use of San Damiano. This is a bit of a closer view of San Damiano, and this is one day I was there last week, and there were 2 people in this huge basilica. I went back another day, there was 1 person. This is the little church of San Damiano, the Porziuncola, and it was described, and the finding of it was described by Francis's first biographer, Blessed Tommaso da Celano, a Franciscan, one of his first followers from the Abruzzo area, and the first biographer. He was a writer and a poet. And he described Francis coming across this little chapel in the wooded valley below Assisi. This Gothic spire was added to the little Porziuncola some years after Francis and his followers gathered around this little church. And also this fresco you're seeing is 19th century. It's frescoed over a 16th century fresco, which is over a 15th century fresco, etc. The church has been much restored over the years. In this little spire here, which has a Gothic feel to it, there is a terracotta sculpture, which is a copy of the original one called Madonna del Latte, which is in the Museum of the Porziuncola, 14th century Sienese. Around the back of the Porziuncola, there is the apse, and above the apse is a fresco done by the great Umbrian painter Perugino. We talked about him a lot in my talk on Perugia, and he frescoed this crucifixion scene in the 15th century. Now let us go around and enter into the Porziuncola. This was the scene I saw one day when I was there. A young man, he sat there for a long time in reflection and prayer. You can see light on the ground in front of him because to his right is an open door. That is the door which leads to the little place where Francis died. We'll see that in a minute. But we want to talk about this fresco over the altar. This beautiful Annunciation by Ilario da Viterbo, done at the end of the 14th century. And look at the beautiful, exquisite golden drapery behind the Virgin. She is a timid young woman. She's pulling the veil towards herself, almost an act of fear. She's holding a Bible. Tradition always tells us that the Bible was opened at the passage of the prophecy that Christ will be born of a virgin in Nazareth, and this has terrified her. The angel Gabriel is blessing her. and letting her know that God the Father wishes her to be the mother of his son. God the Father is above the angel Gabriel, blessing her as well, sending the Holy Spirit, symbol of divine inspiration, which swoops down. Near the fresco of the Annunciation are frescoes by the same artist, depicting moments of the receiving of the plenary indulgence by Francis. After a dream that he had, he will ask Pope Honorius III, who is in Perugia at the time, to recognize, please and kindly, he's asking him, my request, which I learned about in a dream from the Lord and the Virgin wish that any of those coming into my little portiuncula, he wouldn't have said our little portiuncula, will receive a plenary indulgence. That is the forgiveness of all sins. And in 1216, there is the granting of the plenary indulgence by Pope Honorius III. And in the fresco here, we can see Francis announcing to the faithful the reception of the plenary indulgence. He's backed by 7 bishops of Assisi at the time. Look at what the little portiuncula looked like at the end of the 14th century when this fresco was painted. Excuse me, I must correct myself. Not a fresco. This is a wooden panel painting. The artist has painted directly on wooden panel, Ilario da Viterbo, and this Annunciation is not a fresco, it's on a wood panel. And perhaps you can see that here at the bottom. And Francis has announced the plenary indulgence. His parchment says, forgive my pronunciation of Latin, Haec est porta vitae aeternae. This is the door to eternal life. The door into the portiuncula, that is. Now, next to the portiuncula is the chapel of the Transito, La Cappella del Transito. There is a wrought iron gate in front of it. There's no admittance. I just sort of stuck my camera through it to take this photo. This is the place where Francis died, on the ground here next to the altar. He would have been placed on the ground as he wished. He wanted to die naked on the ground at his request. This is the evening of October 3rd, 1226, and he's just outside the little primitive infirmary hut of the Franciscans, which they had near the portiuncula. And we have depicted here a statue of Francis, but let us get a better glimpse of this lovely piece in glazed terracotta by Andrea della Robbia, end of the 15th century. This is a rather melancholic Francis. After all, this is the place where he died. In the reliquary in front of that statue is the cingulum, which is the knotted rope worn around his waist. And all the knotted ropes worn around the waist of the Franciscans and the poor Clares have the 3 knots, symbolizing their 3 virtues: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Surrounding Francis and the reliquary are frescoes done in the 16th century by Giovanni di Paolo. He was called the Spanish one. He was from Spain. He was a follower of the great Perugino. And he depicts various Franciscans. There's Bernard of Siena, St. Bonaventure, biographer of Francis, St. Anthony of Padua. Here we have Brother Leo, Fra Leone. Leone is lion, and he was a dear follower of Francis, one of Francis's favorites. It said, Francis used to call him, he was a big guy, but very gentle, Fra Leone mio piccolo agnello, Brother Lion, my little lamb. In front of the frescoes is always a vase of flowers. These pink begonias were here on a stand. Here, Francis died October 3rd, 1226. Next to the Cappella del Transito, the chapel of transition, shall we say, from this life to the next life, is the Rose Garden of St. Francis. Legend says that he was tormented by temptation, threw himself into roses growing, and the thorns turned to blossoming roses, and he felt no pain. Another tradition says that a bleeding lamb used to follow Francis around. This contemporary statue shows Francis with a lamb, and the bleeding annoyed the noise annoyed the friars as they prayed. And then Francis decided that it too was a way of praising the Lord. So thenceforth, the bleeding joined the friars as they recited their evening prayers. And near the Rose Garden, just across from it, is the Chapel of the Roses, frescoed by Tiberio d'Assisi in 1500, a local Assisi painter. We'll see his work also up at the Hermitage. He often paints on various Franciscan sites. And the Cappella delle Rose first was built on the site of the place of the hut where Francis used to pray. And a little chapel was built there by Saint Bonaventure, who was a follower of Francis. And he was also a biographer of Francis. And then in the mid-15th century, it was enlarged under Bernard of Siena, and there he is. This fresco is actually on the wall of the Porziuncola outside the door leading to the chapel of the transit, Cappella del Transito. Bernard of Siena depicted again inside the chapel of the Roses. And Tiberio di Assisi, inside the Chapel of the Roses, also depicted the episodes of the plenary indulgence called the Pardon, Il Perdono. On the left, Francis is requesting the pardon from Pope Honorius III. On the right, he's announcing to the people that the pardon has been granted. And how lovely is this fresco? Because it shows us what the Porziuncola looked like in 1500. There was another fresco on the facade of Christ and the Virgin. And we can also see here the monastery of the Franciscans, which existed then, no longer exists, disappeared, and all the restoration to create the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels under Alessi in the mid-16th century. Before we leave the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli, I would just like to urge you that when you visit it, when you're in Assisi, take time to visit the wonderful Museo. I could not go into the Museo. Museums have been closed. They'll be open as of Monday, and I'm going right down there to get in there because we still don't have great tourist crowds traveling around Italy. There's the marvelous Giunta Pisano Christus Patiens Crucifix. This is the oldest crucifix existing that we have, depicting a Christo Patiens. This is Christ suffering, Christ as suffering man. And this is the image of the crucifix which the Franciscans loved as they stressed how Christ suffered as we suffer. Cimabue panel is also in there, attributed to Cimabue, late 13th century. Those of you who've toured the Basilica with me, virtually or live, remember that Cimabue frescoed a marvelous fresco in the lower Basilica of France, St. Francis. Another treasure of the Museo of the Porziuncola is Andrea della Robbia's relief here. Christ crowns his mother. This is the marvelous Della Robbia glazed terracotta. Francis here receiving the stigmata. Francis on the left receiving the stigmata. Here we have Annunciation, wonderful piece, again, in the Museo della Porziuncola. And we go outside, and let's look up for a minute at the statue of the Virgin Mary. This was done in 1930 when the facade was restored in about 1928 to 1930. In the earthquake of September 26, 1997, this Virgin wobbled. She was taken down. And in fact, the Basilica underwent restoration following the earthquake. She was placed in front of the Basilica. She's standing in front of the Basilica. This is the entrance to the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels. This is nighttime. The light on her projected on the wall, this shadow, which seems to be St. Francis in prayer. For the locals, it was kind of the second miracle of that Madonna, because it said in 1948 also she moved. She wobbled in the earthquake of 1997, and apparently she moved, I think it was 1948. And let us remember that of St. Mary of the Angels, the heart of that church is certainly the Porziuncola. And if you can't see it in the near future in Italy, why not pop in and see it in San Francisco? This is a copy close to true size. I think it's 78% or something of the true size. And it was created in 2008, I believe, in North Beach. And it is an exact, really, replica of the Porziuncola. And did you know that the second largest city in the United States was named after La Porziuncola? On August 2nd, 1769, a Franciscan accompanying the first European expedition through California, Frate Juan Crespi, who was Spanish, described a beautiful river in his journal, which he named, let me say this in Spanish, forgive my accent, I don't speak Spanish, Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles de la Porziuncola. As that very day, August 2nd, we celebrate the feast of the Perdono, of the pardon. So that river was named after the Porziuncola, but it was shortened to the River of the Angels, and the city nearby was named after the angels today. So please remember the association of Los Angeles to the little Porziuncola chapel when you're next in that part of California. Now we're going to move from the Porziuncola and the history of Francis and his community to modern history as we enter the war cemetery outside of Assisi. It's about 1.5 kilometers away from the Porziuncola and Santa Maria degli Angeli. You could walk here. There's a beautiful path along the way. And here at the war cemetery, 945 soldiers, airmen, military from the Commonwealth were buried in September 1944. This war cemetery was created. And there are rows and rows of tombstones. They're standing saltworthy, they're staltworthy, very straight, evenly spaced rows, like rows really of proud soldiers buried there who had once stood tall and held their heads high as they marched behind their commander. You could see off in the distance the city of Assisi with the fortress at the top. The town of Assisi was liberated on June 17th, 1944 by the battalion of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and with the help of the 8th Indian Infantry Division of the British Indian Army, who'd worked their way north after the Battle of Cassino. 5 of the men who liberated Assisi were also killed at that time and buried in the Assisi War Cemetery. Who were the others? Of the 945 buried in the cemetery, 800 are from Great Britain, 40 were Canadians, 29 from New Zealand, South Africans, 55 South Africans, 10 from India, 1 was the Pioneer Corps of South Africa, and 4 were from Allied nations, other Allied nations, and 1 was never identified. It has been wonderful to walk this cemetery. I think 3 times. I had been there before, but I think this week 3 times, alone all the time, greeting these young boys, the one on the left, 20 years old, the one on the right, 25. The inscriptions are very beautiful. The one on the left says he was always thoughtful, always kind, a beautiful memory left behind. On the right, his life, a precious memory, his absence, a silent grief, always in our thoughts. And on the tombstones are the symbols of their corps or their battalions, these 2 young men flanking the symbol of the Welsh Guards. This one was 19 years old. Here are buried two young New Zealanders. Their symbol has the kiwi of New Zealand. This young man, age 21, belonged to the Royal Hampshire Regiment. And when I was there, I think a couple years ago, the gardeners showed me the row where the Canadians were buried. 40 Canadians there were. And a school group had come to Assisi, and they were from Canada. And the students brought flags to put in front of each of the tombs of the Canadians. The gardeners who care for these tombs are paid for by the Commonwealth. They work full-time. They are completely passionate about their work. They told me that they often talk to the young guys who are there. Not long ago, there was a wonderful project created with the school system of Assisi. Young people visited the tombs at the war cemetery after doing a lot of historical research on this, writing papers about it, creating videos, creating films. They came into the war cemetery. A band leads them in. This is one of the gates on the left, and there's a lovely inscription on the gate. The land on which this cemetery stands is the gift of the Italian people for the perpetual resting place of the sailors, soldiers, airmen who are honored here. So in they came through this gate, all of the students bearing flowers, and they will leave them at each tomb that day. And then at the ceremony, the different students recite their tributes, their historical research. They all receive diplomas, and they receive banners. Printed on the banner is the theme of the project, Pietre della Memoria, the Stones of Memory, which will go back to their schools. Really an extraordinary event. It was written up all in the local papers. The work done by the teachers in preparation for this event was absolutely astounding, as well as the work by the students. After we visit this very serene and peaceful place of reflection, we should go to another peaceful place of reflection. It's on Mount Subasio behind Assisi. This is the Hermitage where Francis withdrew for prayer. It is built on the mountain at about 800 meters above sea level. He often withdrew there for prayer. He would only go up with a few of his followers because they followed the rule of Hermitage. That is, Francis wrote, and this was in his biography, there was a quote from the Regola dell'Eremo, the rule of the Hermitage. Those who want to remain in Hermitage to lead a religious life should be 3 brothers, or 4 at most. Of these, 2 may be mothers, and 2 will be the sons. The 2 that are mothers should maintain the life of Martha, and the 2 that are sons, the life of Mary, and have a single enclosure in which each may have his cell to pray and sleep in. The sons, nonetheless, should now and then take over the duty of the mothers, according to what arrangement they have come to about, taking turns at intervals. Mary and Martha, sisters of Lazarus, Mary, who listened to Christ and prayed with him, and Martha, who served the meals and did the work. So at the Hermitage, 2 will be up there just for prayer for about 10 days. 2 will be there for the Marys. Then 2 are the Marthas. They'll take care of the cleaning, the preparation of food, and so forth. This was the rule of Hermitage. When Francis went up there, they simply stayed in caves, in grottos. This is the entrance to the Hermitage today. This is a contemporary fresco over the entrance. You enter into the woods of live oaks to walk up to the Hermitage. And as you do, you'll pass this bronze sculpture. It's contemporary. I think it was put here in about 2004 or so. This is called Francis, the Saint of Universal Love. And surrounding Francis in the sunburst are symbols here, which are Judaic, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, universal love. And you can see visitors here. Jewish visitors have left stones, as they would do when visiting a cemetery. Some of you heard my talk on the Holocaust survivals in Assisi, and we visited Donaldo's cemetery, who hid the Jewish refugees in Assisi, the priest, and many stones were left there at his cemetery plot by Jewish visitors. The Hermitage walls and so forth are built right into and over the roots of the live oaks. Now, as you enter the Hermitage, there's a little door on the left. If you knock on the door, as I did that day, the kindly little sisters will open the door. 2 or 3 poor Clares live up there now. And look at this is their little living room built right into the bedrock. And they now are assisting the friars who are up there in the cleaning and care of the Hermitage. Then you enter into the little cloister. And this monastery that you're seeing was built under the direction of Bernard of Siena, great Franciscan, in the mid-15th century. So this is not an edifice Francis saw. When he came here, there were simply the caves. My daughter Julia was up there with me the day that I went last week and took this photo. I'm going to enter into the refectory. Over the door is the symbol of Bernard of Siena. IHS, Jesus Hominum Salvatorum, into the refectory. This was all frescoed in the 15th century with the Last Supper, maybe by a friar. At the place at table where Bernard of Siena sat was always a vase of flowers. When I was there, there was an orchid. After you enter the refectory, you can pass through here to see up these steps where the cells are, where the Franciscans stayed and prayed and meditated in the mid-15th century at the time of Bernard of Siena. This is the crucifix hanging on the wall opposite the stairs carried by Bernard of Siena. And those are the cells here. Built right into the bedrock. The door is very small. A Franciscan told me, with whom I spoke recently, that the doors were small. They had to bow their heads, thus reminding them of their insignificance in the world. In the Hermitage, you can also see the 15th century chapel called the Chapel of San Bernardino, fresco artist unknown. And near there, another chapel frescoed by Tiberio da Assisi. We saw his work in Santa Maria degli Angeli. He frescoes in the early 16th century a Madonna and Child, but this is over a 13th century fresco, can you see, of the Crucifixion. And this was probably a little grotto where Francis and followers prayed, later transformed into this little chapel. And this is called Santa Maria delle Carceri, Saint Mary of the Hermitage, because this place is called Eremo delle Carceri, a place of imprisonment, if you will, but self-imprisonment, the willingness to be in this place of self-imprisonment. From here, you go down steps, watch your head. The signs are leading you to the little grotto where Francis slept. This is the Grotto of Francesco. And after he would sleep here on the rock, not naked, but in his poor tunic, very cold, you can imagine, many evenings, he would then go into another adjacent little room where he prayed. They've put the cross of San Damiano in that little adjacent room now. Then you can leave the Hermitage and walk out and see the tree, they say by legend, it did exist at the time of Francis, of the sermon to the birds, but that is legend because that episode when Francis had said, spoke to the birds, took place down near Bevagna at a place called Pian d'Arca. This is the site, they say, where Francis had this conversation with the birds, take off, give flight, and praise the Lord as he would wish. And before you leave the Hermitage, you might want to walk out a bit to the pass, seeing where the grottos were. The grotto, this leads you to the grotto of Brother Leo. Here was an altar place where at one time they could gather for services, pilgrimage groups, no longer, however. And then you want to go up the steps and peek into the little chapel where we have buried one of the Franciscans who lived years after Francis lived, Barnaba, and he, in Perugia, established the first pawn shop in the mid-15th century. That is, he devised a way to assist the poor in order that they could avoid the grasp of usurers. And for some time, the Frati Minori of St. Francis had attempted to resolve the evils of usury. And he established really the first pawn shop. And he is buried here. And it's interesting that 200 years after Francis lived, one of his followers espoused his beloved law of poverty, wishing to assist those who were poor. This is one of the views you'll see as you leave the Hermitage. And you can take a windy road, and it's no longer visitable. The Abbey of St. Benedict of the 12th century is also on Mount Subasio. And this was an extraordinary abbey church. They were in the possession of over 20 chapels, 10 churches. And many of their little chapels were given to Francis for his use. He used the little chapel of the Hermitage. The little oratory was once Benedictine. The little chapel of the Porziuncola, the chapel of San Damiano, they all had once been Benedictine chapels. And we'll just make a quick stop at La Rocca Maggiore. As you come down from the Hermitage, this is pretty much the view you have of this incredible fortress built in the 14th century. There it is, towering over Assisi, a clear sign of papal power. We remember talking about the Albornosian fortresses is my talk on Narni. Cardinal Albornoz in the 14th century, papal delegate, had fortresses built towering over Assisi, Spoleto, and Narni as sort of a backbone to assure papal power in the Papal States after the reentry of the popes from Avignon. And this bastion here, which is rounded, was added by the hated Pope of Perugia. You'll remember from my lecture on Perugia, Paul III, who so heavily taxed salt that they fought the Salt Wars in 1540. He had this bastion added with slit-like openings because from at that time, they're not shooting out crossbows, but they're shooting out cannon against their enemies. The wall here connects to another small fortress called La Rocca Minore, which is a guard tower observing attacks coming over Mount Subasio. And the locals call it La Roccicciola. This is the entrance to La Rocca Maggiore. Look at that wonderful pink limestone of Mount Subasio. And this here is the internal courtyard. Here are some more shots taken inside the massive papal fortress, Rocca Maggiore, the big rock towering over Assisi, built in the 14th century, but on the ruins of another fortress. There was a fortress there built under the reign of Frederick Barbarossa Emperor. When the emperors controlled the area, that was their seat of power. But by 1198, Assisi is no longer Ghibelline supporting the emperors, but it's Guelph supporting the papacy. And the locals attack it, rendering it into rubble. At the time, Francis of Assisi was 16. He probably did not participate in the attack in 1198, but his father probably did. And this is a view from the Rocca at sunset, looking out over Assisi, Cathedral of San Rufino, 12th century, Basilica of St. Clare, where she's buried, and she was buried here in the mid-13th century. And we want to finish our talk with a visit to another site, which is often missed when one is in Assisi, the St. Francis Woods. Many of you have probably seen the Basilica of St. Francis, marvelous church on 3 levels, the tomb, the lower church, this is the upper church, finished in the mid-13th century, the tomb church built to house the body of Francis of Assisi. Pax is on the hedge, is the hedge here for peace. But you may not have gone through this door. and entered into the St. Francis Woods. This is an extraordinary adventure for your next trip. Here you can see the Francis Woods, all in shadow here. Here you see the Basilica. And the St. Francis Woods is now available to visits, and I hope you'll be able to visit when you come here. And it was established by the FAI, which is the Fondo Ambiente Italiana. This is their website, and there's a lot of information on the St. Francis Woods called the Bosco di San Francesco on this website. And they acquired the this property of the Franciscans in 2008, thanks to a donation. It was terribly overgrown. All the woods were overgrown with weeds and so forth, fallen down trees, broken down trees. They cleared the woods. They planted 1,000 other trees and created this extraordinary site called the Woods of St. Francis, Il Bosco di San Francesco. And you can take a walk through these woods. You can head down, coming out the woods. You're going to come to this walled area. This was a Benedictine convent or infirmary of the 12th century. And when Pino and I first moved to Assisi, we couldn't see this. It was covered with weeds and greens, which was all cleared out after this site became the Bosco di San Francesco in 2008. And at that time, the little church next to this was restored. The church called Ponte Santa Croce, finally restored in 2011. It was a 13th century Romanesque church built along the Tiber River. It too was Benedictine. And a 14th century bridge leads to the little church. The bridge was built in the 14th century. It was restored in the middle of this century by the Assisiani. And it is called Ponte dei Galli, which literally would be Bridge of the Rooster. But we think Galli derives from the Longobards word Waldo, meaning the woods, the bridge towards the woods. You can see in the background the Basilica di San Francesco, and all these woods here would be the Bosco di San Francesco. Across from the little church, if you went over the bridge, let me just take you back this way through the olive trees. We're peeking over the bridge. You come to the little mill. It's now a delightful restaurant of the FAI, Osteria del Mulino. This was a 12th century fortified mill where olives were ground into oil, where wheat was ground into flour using the water power of the Tiber River, which is along it. Now, if you take this path behind the mill, you go through the Bosco di San Francesco, and you come to the extraordinary work of land art. The Terzo Paradiso, it's called, done by Michelangelo Pistoletto. What he has done here in this land art is created with 121 olive trees in double rows. He has formed 3 ample circles linked together. And in the center, they're surrounding right here a 12-meter pole representing for him the union between sky and earth. He wishes the observer, Pitolo has written, to walk the serpentine rows, thus becoming a part of the work and reflecting on a desired serene existence between man and nature. That is what is symbolized by this third paradise. That is the third reign. Also part of this land art is the tower here. It's a 14th century tower. It was a fortified tower, maybe a mill tower. And it's named after a former employee of FI of this Italian trust named Anna Maria. So they called it the Torre Anna Maria. And you can visit this Torre di Anna Maria. And we're just going to conclude with a little bit of a personal note. I'm taking you from Ponte Santa Croce. We've left the woods now. We've seen the fortress. We had visited the Basilica on another trip. And we're taking the road up a mountain to a tiny little church called the Church of Pieve San Nicolo. There was a little church here. A Pieve means a country church, probably in the 12th century. This church is not 12th century. In it, an extraordinary fresco was done in 1990 by Mark Balma, wonderful artist from Minnesota, who also frescoed at St. Catherine's College, St. Thomas College. He has done another fresco in Assisi. And in 1990, he and his wife, then Louise, were living near here. And the locals asked him to do a fresco here for this little church of John the Baptist. And this is Mark Balma's fresco. Look at the beautiful textile work of Assisi cross stitch. And here is John the Baptist. And I want you to have a close up because John the Baptist is my beloved brother, Jack. John Robichaud, no longer with us, was Mark Balma's friend and the model for this extraordinary fresco in the little church of Pieve San Nicolo. And Julia and I were recently there, and there I am saying, hello, Jack. So thank you for coming with me to this special place. And thank you for coming with me to the many special places we visited today during our tour. And this is a picture that Julia took of me as I leave the little church, having said goodbye to my brother Jack. I can take you up there if you'd like to go up and see the fresco. I have to call a Franciscan. He's a Polish Franciscan. He's the parish priest. He lives at the Basilica of St. Francis. And if I call him, he'll call Sandro. I now have Sandro's number. He lives in the countryside near there, and he is the key keeper. And he will open for us. And he knew my brother Jack extremely well. And I always go up and visit Jack on June 24th, the feast of John the Baptist, and on my brother Jack's birthday at the end of July. So I wanted to go there this week to include this little treasure outside the walls of Assisi.